In late November and December 1941, the German Afrika Korps was pushed back by Operation Crusader and ended up right where they had started from 10 months before. However, in so doing, Axis supply lines had shortened, and now the Allies were at the long end of their supply tether. On January 21, 1942, General Oberst Erwin Rommel surprised the British with a reconnaissance in force from El Agela. When he found that 8th Army forward elements were dispersed and tired, Rommel continued the offensive and pushed them back over their recently won ground. By early February, this became a flight to safety for the British, who finally stopped retreating only when they reached prepared defensive positions at the Gazala Beer Hachaim line. Then there was a lull in the fighting that lasted for several months, while both sides resupplied and prepared for what would come next. This is a good example of the dynamic back-and-forth seesaw fighting that characterized the North African campaign. During this pause, both sides developed their own strategies. In early May, the British had intelligence reports that suggested that the Axis would be ready to launch their offensive soon. This was a problem for the British because the earliest that General Sir Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief Middle East, was ready to resume the offensive was June 1st. After problems with Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham's leadership in Operation Crusader, C.N.C. Auchinleck replaced him with Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie as head of 8th Army in late November. The Auk, as Auchinleck was nicknamed, did interfere considerably with Ritchie's plans and tactics. The Auk had already used this command method in Operation Crusader, and he felt it suited him well. It had appeared to work earlier in Operation Crusader, so he believed he could safely continue this dual command structure. In this battle, it was like Rommel was maneuvering against two disagreeing generals. Although Ritchie certainly was a veteran of past battles, he lacked experience handling large formations and, as an infantryman, had almost no knowledge of how to correctly employ armored units. These two decisions, the replacement of 8th Army's commander and the confusing command structure, would later come to haunt the British. Even though Ritchie wasn't ready for the offensive yet, he had to create a good defensive strategy to meet Rommel's possible upcoming attack. One strategy he considered was to concentrate his forces in the north, but there was a high risk that the Germans and Italians would simply outflank him in the south. Another strategy was to thinly extend his line to Beer Hachaim with defensive boxes, minefields, and earthworks. This would be problematic for the British because the boxes were too far apart to be mutually supporting and the artillery didn't cover the minefields well enough. However, in the Auks and Ritchie's minds, there was one thing favorable to this strategy. If Rommel decided to outflank them in the south, then it would greatly stretch his supply lines and leave his forces and supplies vulnerable to a British counterstrike. There are actually more possible strategies than just these two. After all, if you're going to outfox the Desert Fox, then you're going to have to think up something more complicated than one of these two strategies. It's apparent that British generalship in this battle was at a low point and was not imaginative at all. If you have any better strategies than these, then please leave them in the comments section below. Anyway, moving on. Perhaps Ritchie should have listened to Frederick the Great, the model Prussian commander that all good generals strove to emulate. He who defends everything, defends nothing. By the way, there is a companion video from EmersusTech that covers the British defensive philosophies for this time period called British Boxes in the North African Desert, World War II. I highly recommend that you watch this companion video to get a fuller understanding of what was going on in the North African Desert at that time. Ritchie correctly guessed that the main danger would likely be coming from the south. Even so, he positioned most of his armor in the rear center to play it safe. Beyond that, the British strategy was just to wait for Rommel to make his move. If he didn't, then they would resume offensive operations within less than a month. On the Axis side, Rommel wanted to throw the British off balance. In Phase 1, Rommel's strategy was to try to fool the British into thinking that Axis forces were attacking their positions with armor in the north and center. He hoped that the British would believe that this was the main effort and bring their armor up to shore up their front line. This would make British armor out of position and useless for the next day's fighting. In Phase 2, just as Ritchie had guessed, Rommel planned to personally lead the Afrika Korps, the 90th Light Division, and the Italian 20th Corps under the cover of darkness in a sweep south of Beer Hachaim, the furthest Allied outpost occupied by the Free French garrison. Some of the armor that attacked in the north would follow on south later. The plan was to move in the early hours of the morning with total secrecy, and then head north and attack the Allies behind their lines. Rommel expected to completely surprise the British with this nighttime move. Let's look at the relative numbers before the start of the Battle of Gazala. Axis: 90,000 men, 60,000 Italian, 30,000 German, 560 tanks, and 228 were Italian. There were 542 aircraft. On the Allied side, 110,000 men, 843 tanks, and 604 aircraft. In the late afternoon of May 26th, Rommel struck first with Operation Venice and launched a feint attack against the northern section of 8th Army's line with his majority Italian Gruppa Crüwell. Shells screamed overhead toward the dug-in positions of the Gazala line, between Gazala and Sidi Mufta. Stuka dive bombers strafed British positions as German panzers rushed forward. But then, as the light began to fade, the panzers were withdrawn to head south while trucks carrying aircraft engines slowly circled around the barren desert, churning up dust and sand to give the British the impression that the Axis were gathering more of their armor for the next day's attack. Panzerarmee Afrika headed south to swing around Ber Hacheim. Even though Rommel believed that he had maneuvered in total secrecy, the armored cars from the 4th South African Armored Car Regiment were observing and shadowing his motorized columns from a discreet distance, reporting all movements back to Corps headquarters. Even though the Allies had this information in hand, they weren't sure what to make of it. Was this southward movement a feint? Ritchie just sat on this information and did nothing with it for the time being. After a brief break to refuel and eat, at around 4:30 in the morning of May 27th, Rommel led his vast mobile armored force around the southern flank of the British line. The first shock for the Axis forces came when the Italian Ariete Armored Division ran into the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade, which was just south of the Free French soldiers at Ber Hacheim. The Ariete Division tore into the Indians, virtually wiping them out and taking 450 Allied prisoners of war. During the night, the British 4th Armored Brigade, part of 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, was told to move south, one of the few British command decisions made in response to the incoming intelligence reports. At about 7:30 in the morning, they advanced straight into the German 15th Panzer Division. The British had received new Grant tanks from the United States, which they used to full effect on the Germans. Rommel wrote in his journal, "The advent of the American tank tore great holes in our ranks. Our entire force now stood in heavy and destructive combat with a superior enemy. The Germans quickly rallied and sent a battalion of panzers to the right to surprise the British, and then used a battery of 88s to support the counterattack. The British tankers realized that they were up against a very large force and quickly retreated north after taking a large number of casualties. Meanwhile, the German 90th Light Division pushed north towards El Alamein and overran the 7th Motor Brigade Group's headquarters vehicles and captured many of the command staff, including Major General Frank Messervy, the commander of the Desert Rats. Fortunately for the British, Messervy removed his badges of rank and escaped to his division 2 days later. Panic and confusion had spread as Allied brigades went up against Axis divisions, and the resulting losses were predictable. 30th Corps Commander Lieutenant General Charles Norrie found that Rommel had smashed his entire southern flank, with the exception of the Free French holding out at Ber Hacheim. His only immediate reserve was the 1st Armored Division, which he quickly ordered south to counter the Axis offensive. However, the 22nd Armored Brigade attacked first and lost 30 tanks destroyed. As the Axis divisions approached Ekruma and Commonwealth Keep, the British regrouped and attacked again, this time supported by artillery. This unwound Rommel's strategy and even surrounded Rommel's advanced panzers for a time. British tankers destroyed some of the German soft-skinned rear supply vehicles. Ammunition and fuel was running low for the Axis advance. Rommel's plan was unraveling. As Rommel looked at his precarious position on the map, he realized that his plan to overrun the British behind the Gazala line had misfired. The Allies were stronger than he had expected. His forces were almost surrounded, his supply lines long and subject to air attack. He hadn't smashed the British armor nor stopped them from being able to reorganize. Even though he had fuel shortages, Rommel ordered the 21st Panzer Division to head north for the coast to continue the advance and put pressure on the Allies, but many of the Axis units paused and regrouped. The 21st Panzer advanced within 5 miles or 8 kilometers of the sea, and was even able to use its artillery to interdict Allied traffic on the Via Balbia road. But then Rommel decided that this wasn't the bold push that he wanted, and called the division back to the main camp on the Triglia-Capuzzo road. 2 Italian divisions managed to carve out 2 shorter supply routes through the minefields. Rommel was so concerned about supplies that he personally led a supply column to ensure that supplies got to his forward elements through the new routes. There was some real personal danger here, but due to his efforts, the supplies got through. At this point, something happened that showed Rommel wasn't just any general, but a great strategist. He shifted gears and adapted a defensive posture for the time being. He consolidated his forces, shortened his front, and laid out a defensive anti-tank screen of 90 pieces facing east. Norrie attempted to launch a concentrated attack against the German lines to pinch them against the rear of the British 50th Division on the Gazala line, but it was slow and uncoordinated and failed miserably. The only good fortune that the British had on May 29th was that General der Panzertruppe Ludwig Kruvel, commander of the northern attack, was captured after he was shot down flying over 50th Division's positions. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring just happened to be visiting the headquarters and he immediately took over, so there was no Axis command loss because of Kruvel's capture. Rommel realized that the box manned by Brigadier Cecil Hayden's 150th Brigade near Sidi Mufta threatened his 2 minefield gaps with artillery, and therefore had to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Even though his box was well supplied, Hayden had to limit his artillery to 25 shells a day because he knew that his brigade would need all the shells possible for the upcoming battle. So there was some supply interdiction by 150th Brigade, but not as much as anticipated by Rommel. At 30th Corps and 8th Army headquarters, there was a lot of optimism that Ritchie had Rommel cornered and was about to crush the Afrika Korps. What followed was a series of uncoordinated British attacks by 2nd, 22nd Armored Brigades and the 201st Guards Brigade, which the German anti-tank screen successfully fought off, just as Rommel had anticipated. The British didn't coordinate and concentrate their armor to an effective degree to deliver a killer blow all at once, and this led to a great loss of British armor. Rommel personally reconned the 150th Brigade box area for an assault the next morning by units of the Afrika Korps, 90th Light, and the Italian Trieste divisions. Rommel issued a formal request for surrender to Brigadier Hayden, who rejected it without comment. In response, the Axis side launched an intense artillery bombardment and an immediate assault by the 90th Light Division's infantry on the edge of the box. German and Italian units fought their way forward yard by yard and in hand-to-hand combat against the toughest British resistance imaginable, and by late in the day had penetrated a substantial distance into British positions. The next day, after heavy Stuka attacks, German infantry again surged forward against the British field positions. Trench by trench, the elaborate British defenses were won. It was a bloody affair. At one point, Rommel himself took charge of a leading assault platoon. By early afternoon, the entire area was in Axis hands. 150th Brigade box commander Brigadier Hayden was killed and the survivors surrendered. Ritchie still hadn't attacked the cauldron in force. Rommel now had 2 unmolested direct supply routes eastward through the minefields and was no longer surrounded. Rommel was impressed by Hayden's resistance and rushed in to congratulate him, but sadly, Hayden had perished in the fight. On the Allied side, Ritchie pondered what to do next. Ritchie's commander, Auchinleck, correctly believed that there was an absence of German tanks in the north, and proposed a bold thrust out of the 13th Corps area heading for Bir Atameron in the Axis rear, almost 10 miles or 16 kilometers away from the Gazala line. The Auc also proposed a wide sweep below the Axis southern flank. Both were rejected by Ritchie and his corps commanders because they felt that they couldn't hold back Axis armor while these moves were being made. Ritchie was also concerned about Tobruk's defense. So Ritchie decided that the best course of action was the most obvious one: attack Rommel's forces in the cauldron once again. The problem is that this move was obvious to Rommel too. It was exactly what he expected the British to do. Looking at the map, Rommel could see that the only remaining thorn in his side that could hamper a new thrust behind the Gazala line was the Free French holdouts in the Ber Hachiim box in the southwest. So he dispatched forces southwards in a mopping up operation. Ber Hachiim was first attacked by the Ariete division early in the Battle of Gazala, but it was too strong to take and the French held on. The Ariete later moved on north. With the addition of the Trieste and the 90th Light Divisions and 3 armored reconnaissance regiments from the 17th Italian Division Pavia, the Axis assault force numbered in total about 45,000 men against roughly 3,600 Free French troops and assorted other allies. The deep fortifications of Ber Hachiim were a rough pentagon pointing north, about 2.5 by 3 miles or 4 by 5 kilometers wide. The perimeter and central areas were honeycombed with 1,200 entrenchments, foxholes, gun emplacements, and underground bunkers, deep camouflage hides for vehicles and supply dumps. The interior of the fort was divided into zones, each with the responsibility of a unit, with the command headquarters near the center at the crossroads. Active patrols moved along lanes in the minefields. The Allied troops defending here were mostly French, but there was a mix of legionnaires, political refugees, colonials, and support troops. Some of the French had fought in Norway, and others were veterans of the fighting in Italian Eritrea and French Syria against the Vichy regime. Over the next week, after Rommel focused his attention on the isolated box, the Luftwaffe bombed and strafed the French entrenchments, but they were so well constructed and blended in with the desert floor that the bombs had little effect. Axis troops intensely poured on the fire, but the French tenaciously held on. The British Desert Air Force supported the box numerous times by strafing the Italians and Germans in the open desert. While this was going on June 5th, Ritchie launched Operation Aberdeen to crush Rommel's position in the Cauldron and take pressure off the French. The British opening artillery barrage landed in an empty desert because the Germans had moved back their front line. The British ran into a fresh German minefield that came as a nasty surprise. First, the 9th Indian Infantry Brigade attacked the Cauldron from east to west. Then the British 32nd Army Tank Brigade attacked the 21st Panzer from the north. 22nd Armored Brigade then moved through the 9th Indian and was hit by the German anti-tank screen. Due to explicit orders not to stay in the battle to support the infantry if they got into trouble, they veered north and circled back, leaving the 9th Indian on its own. Once again, the attack was uncoordinated and done in a piecemeal fashion and mauled by the German accurate anti-tank fire. The 2nd Armored Brigade arrived near Knightsbridge but didn't do anything because its orders weren't precise. To give a good example of the losses, the 32nd Army Tank Brigade lost 50 of the 70 tanks that it started the battle with. Rommel then launched a counterattack with 15th Panzer and the Ariete Division and almost destroyed the 9th Indian Brigade, which retreated, and then destroyed the 10th Indian Brigade, capturing large numbers of infantry. Rommel wasn't quite ready to fully advance yet, not with the French still on his flank. Finally, on June 10th, the Free French defenders were exhausted and so critically low on ammunition that the last reserves were issued and bodies were searched for spares. They knew that the next assault would probably succeed, so when darkness fell, they quietly destroyed any military equipment that wasn't mobile, opened gaps in their minefield, and then slipped away. There was only a small remnant left to disguise the retreat from the Germans. This fight galvanized Allied French morale around the world and showed that the French really could still fight the Germans after the humiliation of 1940. About 2,700 Allied troops managed to make it back to the British lines after the escape. About 845 Allied prisoners were taken, but reportedly only 10% were French. Even though Hitler had ordered that any captured German political refugees were to be killed, Rommel just ignored the order. The Axis paid a heavy price for Ber Hachiim, even though it was a necessary fight. They lost 3,300 dead or wounded, 227 captured, 164 vehicles destroyed, and 49 aircraft shot down. At this point in the battle, Ritchie had 2 reinforcement Indian brigades that had just arrived, and even with their tremendous tank losses, they still had 70 more tanks than the Axis forces. However, Rommel retained the initiative for most of the Battle of Gazala. Ritchie's corps commanders, Lieutenant Generals William Gott and Charles Norrie, were vigorous in their objections to Ritchie's proposals, and at times he wasn't able to force them to do what he wanted them to do. To be fair, Norrie and Gott were more experienced with armored warfare in the desert, but this lack of command from the top down, in addition to Auchinleck occasionally sticking his nose into things, made for confusion on the battlefield, to say the least. What's worse is that Allied morale was sinking. The average Allied soldier noticed that lately, every time that British armor fought Axis armor, that the British side always seemed to lose and had to break away from the battlefield, leaving behind valuable damaged vehicles which the Axis recovered. They also felt that their British commanders weren't up to fighting the Desert Fox and winning. British replacement tanks often needed maintenance before they could go back into action. Many experienced British tankers were becoming fatalistic and sensed ultimate defeat. Friction was growing as setbacks and frustrations mounted. Rommel briefed his Italian and German commanders that the original goals of Operation Venice were still to be pursued. He concentrated his mobile forces and then moved against the center of the British rear. Here are Rommel's objectives for each attacking division. 90th Light Division. Move along the right flank, pass south of El Adama, and make for the British supply center at Belhamid. 15th Panzer and Trieste divisions would take the left flank and strike between El Adama and Knightsbridge, directly towards Tobruk. Their first objective would be the airfield near El Adama. 21st Panzer and Ariete, close to the Cauldron, would protect the supply routes to the west, hold the British infantry in the new defense lines, and threaten the British armor around Knightsbridge. Lieutenant General Norrie wanted to combine 2nd Armored Brigade with 7th Armored Division to gather enough armor to come down from the high ground and overwhelm the 15th Panzer Division in the flank. However, due to British commanders bickering amongst themselves, there was a lot of confusion and insubordination in the British force, and nothing came of Norrie's plan. While the Germans and Italians were preparing for an attack, the commanders of both 2nd and 4th Armored Brigades sat in position and awaited orders. Rommel ordered that 30th Corps was to be attacked, and followed along to put some energy into the attack. The 21st Panzer Division crashed into the right flank of the 4th Armored Brigade. German anti-tank guns moved forward to shell the British from the other flank. The British were beginning to panic, and only the arrival of the 22nd Armored Brigade allowed the 4th Armored to retreat in disorder to the El Adama-Ekruma road. Both German panzer divisions moved north, the 15th to a position between the British armor and El Adama, the 21st to the western side of Knightsbridge. The 90th Light stood between El Adama and the supply center at Belhamid. German panzers hit the British so hard that the battle to the south of Knightsbridge was decisive. British losses of 138 tanks in this one afternoon forced a withdrawal to the northeast, leaving the Gazala line formations of 8th Army vulnerable. Black Saturday. At this point, Ritchie realized that he had two bad options: stand and fight, or retreat all forces. There were risks with both options. If he stood firm and his already depleted armor was destroyed, then the infantry divisions might be cut off. If he retreated, then it would be a running fight. He told Auchinleck that he would stand and fight. Rommel tried to push his men to get to the sea and surround the two divisions still in the Gazala line, but they were so exhausted that they couldn't overcome the two boxes around Eliat et Tamar. The 201st Guards Brigade was forced to retreat from the Knightsbridge defensive position in the center of the British line. Auchinleck now realized that the Axis had superior quantity and quality armor in the battle after the most recent disastrous engagements. Now, it seemed that survival was the order of the day for the Allies in the desert. Ritchie had to figure out how to get the two divisions in the Gazala line to retreat without losing them. Then there was Tobruk. The earlier saga of the Siege of Tobruk in 1941 had captured the imagination of the British public at home. It was a story of good outlasting evil. The moral of the story was that the British would eventually overcome the Axis in the desert. Now the question was, defend Tobruk or not? In February 1942, Auchinleck and Ritchie had decided that if Rommel were ever to be successful, then Tobruk wasn't to be held. There wasn't to be a besieged garrison waiting to be rescued as before. Now, Ritchie didn't know what to do. If he defended Tobruk and the city was lost, then the troops would be lost too. On the other hand, he didn't want to just give up such a symbolic city with a storied past. In the end, Ritchie tried to find a middle ground where there was no middle ground. He would half-heartedly defend the city and only burn the stores if or when the Axis troops came rolling in. The problem was that the Tobruk defenses of June 1942 weren't like they were the year before. Most were in disrepair and stripped to build the Gazala line. Sure, there were plenty of foodstuffs, fuel, equipment, everything an army needs in the field, but the outer perimeter defenses were lacking. When Ritchie signaled to Auchinleck that he was thinking about partially defending Tobruk, Auchinleck was confused. He believed that Ritchie meant to hold on when he said that he would stand and fight. However, here he was ordering a full-scale retreat? The Auk countermanded Ritchie and ordered that Tobruk must be held. When nighttime came, the 1st South African Division was to silently withdraw to the rear. This worked so well that the Axis troops didn't realize that they were gone until the morning. The 50th Division had to break out to the southwest, through the minefields in order to swing southeast and retreat to Egypt. Amazingly, this audacious plan worked, probably because no one expected it. Rommel's forces began to pick off the isolated positions west of Tobruk. 8th Army at this point was in danger of collapse. Rommel's forces made it to the sea to the east of Tobruk, and once more the port was surrounded. Tobruk was attacked from the east by the Afrika Korps. A break-in was soon achieved with massed air support and penetrated a weak spot on the eastern defensive perimeter. Axis forces quickly spread out within the fortress area and captured the port. The commander of the 2nd South African Division, Major General Hendrik Klopper, surrendered the Tobruk garrison after a brief fight. In one fell swoop, South Africa lost 1/3 of their entire army along with a vast amount of undestroyed supplies. Much of the garrison on the western perimeter had not been attacked, but they were cut off from their supplies and transport. Without the means to escape from Tobruk, the majority had to surrender. Over 32,000 Allied prisoners were taken. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was meeting with U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt at the Second Washington Conference, which discussed how the Western Allies could best aid the Soviet Union, when he got the news that Tobruk had fallen to the Axis. Churchill was shocked and humiliated. President Roosevelt asked how he could help. Churchill immediately replied, "Give us as many Sherman tanks as you can spare and ship them to the Middle East as quickly as possible." In the end, the Battle of Gazala was a very large battle with some smaller but significant battles. Like many of the North African campaigns, it was a seesaw affair, with one side seemingly being temporarily favored, and then a shift happened, with the other side gaining the upper hand. Rommel wrote in his journal, "What is the use of having overall superiority if one allows each formation to be smashed piecemeal by an enemy who's able to concentrate superior forces on every occasion at the decisive point?" Rommel was highly critical of British generalship during this period. Ritchie, after all, had 3 divisions, the 1st South African, the 50th, and the 1st Armored Division, sitting around almost doing nothing. In fact, it was so lopsided that one could say that this battle showed Rommel at his best and the British leadership at their worst. Rommel knew that they could have done better, but Auchinleck and Ritchie failed to use their advantages of numbers, and they were easily predictable. There were a few key moments when the British command could have crushed the Afrika Korps, and they wasted them. On the other hand, Rommel came out of this battle shining larger than life even in the British soldier's imagination. He had a plan that misfired, but then he adapted and forced the enemy to fight on his terms. Whether Rommel knew it or not, he used one of Sun Tzu's maxims. Take and hold a position that the enemy must take. The position that Rommel held was the rear center of the Gazala line, which made the Gazala line untenable. So, the British appeared to have 2 choices: destroy Rommel or retreat. Rommel knew that the British would likely attack, and so he set up an anti-tank screen in the most likely avenue. The British obliged him by running their armor up against the anti-tank screen in efforts to dislodge the cauldron. Going back in time, Rommel's strategy was a variation of Napoleon's strategy of the central position, in which a smaller army stays in the middle of 2 larger armies and defeats them in turn. The variation was that Rommel was defending on his right, while heading left and then the south, then regrouping for a massive thrust right. This is the epitome of Bewegungskrieg, the German war of movement. Once the British offenses were spent, Rommel counterattacked and pursued his original aims, except this time, the British were exhausted and in full flight, with a lowered morale and leaving behind massive amounts of fuel and equipment. The Axis advance was so rapid that the Auk fired Ritchie and took personal command on the ground. The Auk tried to put on a brave face for his men, but this defeat was so serious that Cairo and all of Egypt was now in real danger. The Auk initially wanted to make a do-or-die stand at Mersa Matruh, but he realized that as long as the Allied army existed, then they had a chance. If he lost it all in one last stand, then all would be lost in the region, so he changed his strategy to be more flexible. By June 30th, all units of 8th Army that had survived the long retreat were digging in at the El Alamein line, waiting for Rommel to launch his next attack. In the end, the only good that seems to have come out of the Battle of Gazala was that the French were back in the fight and ready to fight on. Later, Monty would take over, but that is a story for another video.